And some of you may know that Brett and his wife, Betsy, decided to retire, and they were going to build a house. But no, something happened. There was they're not going to attribute it to any one specific thing, but they wanted to go out and travel America and find out where they actually belonged in this world after retiring. And it wasn't, again, so much of a political thing. The timing makes it seem like that's true, but it's not. They really wanted to learn more about how people communicate, interact with each other, and where they have different viewpoints and beliefs. So the title of the talk today by Brett is When Your Friends Are Your Political Enemies. Geez, doesn't sound like good dinner conversation to me. But it's how divisive politics can also be used to bring people together. Without further ado, Brett Miller.
Well, after quitting our jobs, selling our house and cars, and storing our stuff, my wife Betsy and I bought this van. And we loaded up our dog, Maybe, and we took off on a very long journey from Springfield. My wife was just finishing up her 30 years as an elementary teacher in the Springfield public school system. I was coming off a 19-year career as a communication professor at Southwest Baptist University. The decade before that, I had been the speech and debate coach at Parkview High School. We decided to dramatically change our lives and do something big because we felt like big things had started to happen in our country that weren't good. Our discourse had become more corrosive, more polarizing, more aggressive than we had ever remembered seeing it in our lifetimes. So we decided to go on the road and try to figure this out, try to figure out what was happening, try to figure out what we could do about it, to do what we call something gigantic. And so we left Springfield there we go. We left Springfield in the end of May, and we just returned a few weeks ago at the beginning of December. Here are the numbers of our trip so far. Miles driven, 18,750. Been to 43 states. The number of hosts we had along the way that put us up in some fashion or helped us out along the way, 106. The nights we spent in the van, 158. The number of times we were accidentally dosed with marijuana cookies, 1. Hours we spent at a roadside park watching All in the Family reruns on the day we were accidentally dosed with marijuana cookies, 4. As it turns out, if you park in someone's driveway overnight and they're sending you off the next morning and they hand you some freshly baked chocolate chip cookies with the instruction, here are some special cookies, that's not enough information. We could spend some time on the communication problems right there. Turns out everybody's fine, everybody was okay, we got a nice nap. It all came out okay in the end. But perhaps the most important number from our trip is the 611 people that we've met so far on the road. This picture is just a fraction of them. And it's been amazing. If there's one takeaway I would say from this talk today, it's that you live in a beautiful country. This is an amazing place. And I think I've always sort of thought that and believed that, but getting to see it day after day in different places and different people every day, this is an amazing place. And we got to meet people from all over, all walks of life, all religions and political ideologies and classes. And we're not done yet. We're actually just in the middle of our project. We head out again in a few days in what I'm calling the tour of ex-governors. The profile of our project has started to rise a little bit, and we've gotten some connections to some really cool interviews and conversations we get to have. We're headed to Santa Fe to interview former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson. Then we get to talk to former Ohio Governor Dick Celeste. Then we're off to talk to former Kansas Governor and former Secretary of Health and Human Services Kathleen Sebelius. And then we end up in Florida talking to former Florida governor and recent presidential candidate Jeb Bush. We're very excited about those conversations we get to have, but I don't think they're going to be any better than the conversations we've had with regular people. And the sort of central question that we've been asking on the road, how do we learn to listen and talk to each other better than we're doing it? Because we're not doing it very well. And I'm not going to stand up here and go through all the proof of that, because I think probably most of you can look around in your own lives and see that. It's not hard to see that it's become increasingly difficult to talk to people we disagree with, to engage conflict. We've adopted a communication model in our culture that we either retreat, we withdraw completely from anything that would even hint of controversy, or we're becoming exceedingly aggressive and we go on the attack. And that's not a sustainable model. It's not a sustainable model for democracy. It's not a sustainable model for our businesses, for our communities, for our relationships. And so we went looking for a better way to do this. We met a ton of people along the way, and I'm going to tell you just a few of those stories. We met Leticia in Portland, Oregon. Leticia is a social worker, and she works with newly arriving refugee families and immigrant populations, both documented and undocumented. And she commented about how it seems like everybody just says what they want now, no matter who it might hurt. She felt she had experienced it personally. Seemed like she had gotten more comments, more racist comments, more sexist comments. The families, her clients that she worked with, kids were staying home from school. Families were sort of going off the grid because they felt threatened and didn't feel safe in their homes because of some of the language that was being shared in public. On the other end of the spectrum, we met Matt and Shay in Orlando, Florida. They were very public, outspoken Trump supporters. And they talked about people that started calling them Nazis and blocking them on social media. And that they told one particular story in detail, but they had story after story of this happening. And this model just repeating itself in relationships with people sort of retreating to their silos and sort of demonizing the people on the other side, this inability to talk across those boundaries. And it didn't just happen at sort of the regular folks level. When we met with Senator Blunt in Washington, D.C., he talked about if you're not divisive, a lot of people in this town don't like that. Well, I mean, Washington's always been a pretty divisive place, right? But everyone we talked to in Washington sort of corroborated the idea that it continues to get worse and worse. Senator McCaskill said divisiveness is the biggest problem facing us, that it threatens to undermine everything we stand for as a country. She put a finer point on it when she said, we don't go to the media for information, we go for affirmation. I thought that was a really great way of framing it. This day and age, we have the capacity to surround ourselves with cable news and talk radio and social media, echo chambers that just confirm our biases and continue to reaffirm the things that we believe to be true. So then when we engage someone with a different point of view, we don't just think, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think they're right. We think they're an idiot. They're a moron. What world are they living in? We lack the complete capacity to understand them at all. We experienced this a little bit personally. We had a little bit of media coverage along the way in our trip. And so we thought, this will be fun. Let's go look at the comment section. That's always a good idea, right? So some of the comments we got. This project is silly on steroids. These, by the way, are the only ones. These are the ones I can show you. What a joke these people are. Screw them. This is a temper tantrum. So tired of the poor baby syndrome. You're a special kind of stupid. We got a lot of snowflake comments. And then my favorite, may you get ran over by a huge oil rig moving down the highway. But this is an illustration of the kind of communication dynamic that we're operating in now, because most people aren't saying anything. But then when we do say something, because I tell you what, we didn't see are comments that are like, that's interesting, tell me more. But so we had kind of a decision to make of how to respond to this, right? We could just say, and what most people said, just don't read the comments, just ignore that stuff. And other people saying, well, you should just let them have it. and, perfectly capable of doing both of those. But we started to take some prompting from what we were seeing on the road and a particular suggestion by our friend Jimmy Ray in Springfield. And I started contacting the most aggressive of the commenters and inviting them to go have a cup of coffee and talk about how they felt. Because not as a stunt, but am I missing something here? Like, why is this making people so mad that my wife and I want to travel around the country and hear people's stories and talk to them? I want to try to figure out where this comes from. It's no surprise to you probably we haven't had any takers yet. No face-to-face, but we have had most people just ignored our messages. But we've had several interesting comments and discussions in response. One woman in particular wrote us a really long, heartfelt apology. We had this great conversation online. We're still planning on getting together. There are a couple people that we plan to get together with, but the schedules just haven't synced up. We talked to one guy who ended up telling us stories about his daughter who had left the faith and the sort of political ideology he had raised her in and moved off to the West Coast. And turns out he was really bitter and angry about that, and I don't think it was about us at all. It was about what he was feeling in his own family, and so we were able to have some empathy for that and talk to him about it. One guy told us a really funny story about how he finally figured out his Facebook account had been hijacked by his 17-year-old son, and that he hadn't said those things at all. So we felt like we prompted a really healthy father-son conversation that night. But along the way, we felt like there's a different way of doing this. There's a different way of us engaging each other. And so what started to emerge on our trip and in our conversations are these three things I want to briefly talk to you about that we started to see coming out. The first is the quality of humility. And humility is simply, for our purposes, the idea of acknowledging that I could be wrong. Sounds easy, not a common thing these days. Most people go into conversations with the assumption I'm right, and I'm going to try with all my might to point out to you how wrong you are. And the act of humility starts to engage the possibility of dialogue. Without humility, you can't have dialogue. Dialogue can't exist. It's just competing monologues. If we just have monologue, then we end up ultimately with one voice that wins. And when one voice wins, we all lose. Because the nature of conflict is opportunity. In conflict is the opportunity for diversity to emerge, for various perspectives to come together and create a new idea. But if all we do is engage in entrenched monologues, battling each other, then we end up really not gaining much. It's a loss of opportunity. So a couple of things that I would point to about humility. We met this guy, Cody, weirdly in Springfield. We were home for a few days in August, and oddly, while we were home, President Trump visited Springfield. And I tried really hard to get into the rally. I wanted to go and see the speech and then talk to people. I couldn't get in, but I was introduced to Cody, who works at the Lauren Cook Company where President Bush appeared. And so we got to talk about the speech, and then he started talking about his coworkers, how in his business, how a lot of people don't all think exactly the same, and that they get along really well. And I was like, wow, tell me about that. I want to hear how that works, because that's not necessarily common. And he said something just sort of offhandedly with, well, everybody knows that they could be wrong. And he goes on and said, whoa, back up. You said everybody sort of acknowledges they could be wrong. I said, don't underestimate how valuable that is. That's a big piece of engaging in meaningful dialogue, of having real conversations. If the assumption we begin with is, I think I'm right, and by the way, understand, I'm not saying backing off with convictions. I'm not saying that we should abandon what we believe to be true, but simply making the provision that there's things I don't know and that I could be wrong about some things. Another example or a hint, a glimmer of humility, we talked to Zach in Los Angeles. Zach is a comedy performer and writer, and he told us these fascinating stories about this kind of behind-the-scenes comedy community. And now these are people that write for all the late-night talk shows, that kind of thing. And he told us about there are these conversations going on amongst a lot of these people about how they may be part of the problem. that by creating humor that's at the expense of other groups and of condescending and sort of creating sort of an elite perspective about humor, that they may be contributing to the deepening of the polarization and the divisiveness. And so it's not changing dramatically yet. I think Sarah Silverman's show, if you've seen it, on Hulu is an example of how comedy's starting to change a little bit. It's still early days for this, but I think we're going to start seeing some things that are changing there instead of just falling back on the same old models. But once we embrace the idea of humility, we can loosen our grip on the need for certainty, the need we have to be absolutely certain and right about everything. When we loosen our grip on those things, then we can start to hold the hand of another perspective. And that's what we describe as empathy. The idea that you try to understand where the other person's coming from. You try to take their perspective. Again, it doesn't mean agreeing with them. I was a debate coach for years. I'm very comfortable having an intense argument with someone I disagree with. But there's a difference between agreeing with someone and understanding where they're coming from. Take a moment to try to feel and see the world the way they feel and see it. And by doing that, we can actually start to have a conversation as opposed to, again, just those competing monologues. One of the coolest examples of empathy we saw along the way, we met this amazing group of people in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And all the stories they told, I could spend an entire day talking about their stories, but this woman sort of near the back with the glasses, Cozy is her name. Her husband's an evangelical pastor in Fayetteville, and she had sympathy for race issues and racial disparities in the country, but she said, I didn't understand why the Black Lives Matter protesters were so angry. Just didn't make sense to me. Why the need for so much anger? Well, then something happened to Cozy, and she ended up in the hospital for 3 months. She was in a coma, lost any ability to be responsive at all. Slowly, she gained the capacity to hear, but she couldn't show any other physical movement or sign to anyone else. So she could hear people talking for her and about her, but she couldn't respond, and her reaction was, what they're saying is wrong. They're misrepresenting me. They're not being honest about how I feel, who I am, and she started just seething with anger about it. When she started to regain some of her physical strength, she started knocking things off her tray in sort of this display of anger. And she said it was that moment I started to understand a little bit how when people can't hear you because they think they know what you believe, they think they know you, and they're speaking for you and about you, and it's not true, that can cause one to feel a little violent. I don't know if all that had to do with this, but I've heard stories now that Cozy and her husband's church in Fayetteville is now because previously it was sort of your typical evangelical church in the Ozarks, sort of an all-white congregation. It's now a multiracial congregation, and they engage in a lot of like racial conciliation work, working with immigrants and that kind of thing. And I would suspect that a great deal of that has to do with the experience of empathy that Cozy had. Another really cool experience we had was in New York City. We got to visit this All-Stars project. And one of the programs they do that's just amazing, it's called Cops and Kids. And they bring NYPD officers together with young people, mostly young men of color from poor neighborhoods. And it's not what you think. They don't just come and sit around a table and hold hands and sing Kumbaya together and somehow magically everything changes. They bring them together. Their offices, their program is set on 42nd Street in the theater district. And they bring them to a theater and they play improv games. And if you've ever been around improv or done improv before, it's risky. Yeah. Because there is the risk of looking silly and being very embarrassed. And so you have to shed a lot of your self-protection. You have to become vulnerable. So they do that first. Then they sit them down face to face and talk. And what they've seen happen is the officers will start to hear stories from these young men about how sometimes they have to give up meals to feed their younger siblings and that their lives are a daily cycle of trauma. And these young men get to hear that these officers are scared too. and that they often have to leave their families on weekends and holidays. They don't get to be home with their kids at Christmas because they're on the street. And it doesn't change, none of these things change everything, but it's the beginnings of a different way of communicating rather than this sort of de facto way that we've started embracing of retreating or attacking. The third component of this new approach to communication is honesty. And by honesty, I mean simply what it says, being truthful, but not just truthful to other people, being truthful to ourselves, being honest about what the facts are of the matter so that we can proceed in a meaningful conversation. One of the more colorful figures we met along the way was this guy in Tallahassee, Florida, named Mac Stepanovich. Mac is a major player in the Republican Party. He's a lobbyist. This guy has been a part of every sort of powerful move in the Republic. If you paid close attention to the 2000 recount in Florida, Mac was a big part of that. This guy is connected. He is the poster child for conservative Republican politics in America. He can't stand Donald Trump, interestingly. He said things like, "I have a contempt for him I usually reserve for snakes." He went on to say, if he and I were in the 5th grade, I'd fight him every week and my dad would buy me ice cream for it. He was a colorful figure. But as we got kind of past the politics and we talked about the kind of the more personal, the intimate parts of our lives, he told me a story that was very compelling. He said, and again, remember, this is a conservative Republican. His first grandson was born. They're lying on the couch. He's got his grandson just laying there on his chest. And out of the blue, he just starts thinking, what if he grows up to be a homosexual? You know, and he said, do I want people to deny him housing and jobs and other opportunities? No. He said, well, then maybe I shouldn't want that for other people's grandkids. And as an act of humility and empathy, and the point is not to say something about gay rights legislation, that's not the point. The point is that Mac probably isn't going to change his attitude about Donald Trump. But there are some places where Mac could start to have some dialogue and start to have some conversation that's going to be different than the way he's typically wired up because of humility and empathy and then ultimately being honest with himself about some things. A final example, we stopped at Chick-fil-A headquarters in Atlanta. You would be amazed how many people talked about Chick-fil-A on this trip. It's like, what a weird, it is a lightning rod of emotions in this country. And you can really sort of line people up about what they think about Chick-fil-A. And so we were touring the place. Jessica is a marketing executive there. She's telling us all about the company. And so I kept wanting to talk about this because, as you all remember, 5 or 6 years ago, the big controversy, Dan Cathy, the CEO of Chick-fil-A, made some comments about same-sex marriage, and sort of overnight, the liberal, progressive LGBT community started seeing Chick-fil-A as homophobic and anti-gay, and the conservative, evangelical, traditional values crowd saw Chick-fil-A as the champions of morality, and there was this huge sort of divide. And so I kept probing, tell me about what was going on here with that. Well, Jessica pointed out to me that there were a number of LGBT people that work in this office. That she said Chick-fil-A does not have and never did have a policy that was anti-gay. That those were the comments of Dan Cathy. Those were the comments of an individual in the family that founded Chick-fil-A. Those were never reflected in the policies of our company. I said, yeah, but we met a lot of LGBT people out there on the road who think you don't like them. And so those are two, and there's still plenty of discussion to be had about Chick-fil-A and about their public relations and about their marketing. But if we're going to have that debate or that argument or that discussion, we have to be honest about what Chick-fil-A actually did, what they actually believe, what their actual policies are, and no matter how good they think they're doing, how people actually receive that, how people actually feel. Those are honest, truthful things that we have to talk about if we're going to have a meaningful conversation. So it's interesting times we live in. There's great opportunity here, but I think that we've adopted a communication pattern of retreat and attack that's unsustainable. It's not good for us. It's like an addiction that we can't seem to get rid of. And it's harming us personally, it's harming our relationships, it's harming our communities, and it's harming our country. It seems like what we're finding is if we deploy a different method, if we start incorporating more humility, more empathy, more honesty in our discourse, we can start to see some changes. I'll leave you with a bit of wisdom from Star Wars, The Last Jedi. We'll win this war not fighting what we hate, but saving what we love. So a couple of questions. Do you agree with that? If you accept that statement, if you don't accept that statement, I don't know what to tell you, because it's awesome. If you do accept that statement, then the next question would be, so what do you love? What do we love? Do we love being right? Do we love certainty? Do we love winning? Is it important for us to be victorious? Is that what's most important? Or do we love the people in our lives? Do we love our family? Do we love our neighbors? Do we love our communities? Do we love our clients and our customers? Do they matter to us? If they do, then I would encourage you to start using the communication patterns of humility, empathy, and honesty, and then we can all do something gigantic. We're going to still be on the road for a while. If you want to reach us, send us nasty comments, or whatever, feel free to do that. We're going to be doing everything pretty much the way we've always done it, except that we're accepting no cookies from strangers. Thank you.